In the next 20 minutes or so, I will present the project at which I am currently working and which is supported by a Mind Senior Research Fellowship. So thank you very much to the Mind Association for their support. Thinking with Assent, renewing a traditional account of knowledge and belief. First of all, a few words of introduction. If I had to summarize this project in a few words, I would use two complementary slogans. Knowledge first, but give belief its due. For the past century, as you know, epistemological debates have focused around a conception of knowledge as a kind of belief which meets certain criteria. As you will also know, this account has run into many problems, counterexamples, charges of circularity. So over the past 2 decades, the calls for alternative accounts have grown louder. And the leading contender amongst alternative accounts is the knowledge-first epistemology advocated by Timothy Williamson. Williamson argues for the conceptual priority of knowledge to belief. And I quote now from his milestone book of 2000, the further one is from knowing P, the less appropriate is to believe P. Knowing is in that sense the best kind of believing. Mere believing is a kind of botched knowing, unquote. In short, for Williamson, knowing entails believing, but this entailment does not imply that knowledge is analyzable in terms of belief. Now, my project intends to further the revolt against the post-Gettier epistemology, but in a way which seems to me more radical than what proposed by Williamson. And I do this, first of all, by challenging the crude history of epistemology, according to which justified true belief is the standard or traditional account of knowledge. If one goes back to the history of philosophy, one sees that this allegedly standard or traditional analysis is neither standard nor traditional. On the contrary, I argue that leading authors in this past tradition argue that knowledge should not be analyzed in terms of belief or belief characterized in terms of knowledge. According to their, I think, generally traditional views, knowledge and belief are distinct in kind, in the sense that knowing is not a superior species of believing, but a mental state of a different kind. So the core of my project proposes an account of cognition according to which knowledge and belief are irreducibly distinct kinds of knowing, of thinking with assent, that cannot be analyzed or characterized in terms of one another. According to this proposal, knowledge is not only conceptually and ontologically prior to belief, it is also and crucially not a kind of belief. In turn, believing is not some sort of botched knowing, but a mental state fundamentally different from knowing, with its own distinctive and complementary role in our cognitive life. So contrary to the claim that belief aims at knowledge, that, as you know, has been strongly argued for in the past 2 decades, I argue that the specific contribution of belief to our cognition is that of aiming at truth, where and when knowledge is out of our cognitive reach, either for subjective or for objective reason. In this framework, therefore, belief aims at truth, not at knowledge. The project has 3 parts. The first part rediscovers an historically well-attested account of cognition significantly different from 20th century mainstream views. The second part, which is the core part of the project, employs a version of this rediscovered tradition in a fresh restatement of the relationship between knowledge and belief. And the third part applies this reconceived relationship to religious belief in particular. Now, in what follows, I will say a few words about these three parts. So the first section is the part in which I retrace, rediscover an important strand of thought which runs really from ancient philosophy up to the early at the very least, the early 20th century philosophy. And I try to trace some of the highlights in this story, starting from Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and then going to some highlights in medieval philosophy, some very important authors in medieval philosophy, then early modern philosophy, especially Descartes, Kant. I then devote an important part to Hume, which I think marks really a sort of important turning point in the story. And then I look at Kant, how to see the distinction of kind in Kant, and up, as I was saying, to the early 20th century. And now, obviously, I don't have here the time to go into any details, but these constitute the core of a paper I have recently given at the Aristotelian Society, and which is available online in case somebody is interested in knowing more about this first part. So here I will just say that according to a persistent and genuinely traditional strand of thought, which I have traced, knowledge derives directly from its object, which is present in a primitive and irreducible way to the mind of the knower. That is, knowledge is a primitive perception or an irreducible mental seeing or grasping. Belief, on the contrary, is a mental state or a cognitive mode in which precisely the perception or presence of the object which characterizes knowledge is lacking. Now, it is important to note at this point, to stress at this point, that at least for important past authors in this tradition, which I have traced, at least for some important authors, belief does not imply speculation determined by something other than convincing reasoning. So the grounds for believing may be very strong, and belief can be true and strongly justified, and still on this traditional account, such a belief would not be knowledge, but a different mental state or cognitive mode. So these authors would be perfectly aware that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge, but not because something else needs to be added, but because believing is a different mental state than knowing. I come now to the second part of my project, the core, more constructive, positive part, in which I propose a renewed version of this traditional model. According to the version which I defend, knowledge and belief can both be conceived as kinds of thinking with assent. And this is a version which is inspired by something Thomas Aquinas writes in the Summa Theologiae, and which seems to me really to capture some important insights of both the Platonic and the Aristotelian tradition before him. So according to this model, we think with assent in two ways. When we know something, that is when the mind's assent is moved by the object itself, we see or grasp it, either literally in sense perception or metaphorically in intellectual perception. And we think with assent in another way when we believe something, that is when the mind's assent is not moved by its proper object, but by other reasons external to the object itself. Here is where justification, marks of truth, warrant come in. Now, the more general framework in which this model is placed is that of a primitive openness of mind to reality. Knowledge is a primitive mental state characterized by the presence or manifestation of an object, broadly understood to the mind, in which there is an effective primitive cognitive contact between mind and the world with no gap between knower and known. Belief is an irreducibly different mental state in which the object of cognition is not immediately present to the mind, and assent is moved by reasons external to the object itself. Now, at this point, an important clarification is in order. This discussion is not about which words are used or have been used in a particular language or in a particular historical period to indicate the main modes of human cognition. I am obviously perfectly aware that there is no clean translation between one language and the other, one historical period and the other, one author and the other, of what is called what. This is about the identification of the main cognitive modes themselves and how they are distinguished from one another, whatever they are called or have been called. So in my view, the main battle line in the history of epistemology is drawn between the affirmation of a natural mental state in which there is a contact between mind and reality, whatever the ontological nature of this reality. I think this is a further metaphysical question, and the rejection of such a natural mental state. For the former position, there is a mental state which is different in kind from belief, and which is constituted by the presence of the object of cognition to the cognitive subject with no gap between them. For the latter position, all our cognition is belief. That is a mental state in which there is not this contact with what is. And the question becomes how and when belief is permissible. So the bar for knowledge in this proposal is set very high. In my view, there could be no successful cognition without a primitive contact between mind and reality. But what we know and can know is limited because at its most fundamental, at its most paradigmatic, knowledge is akin to acquaintance, and in intellectual cognition involves understanding. I am talking of paradigmatic knowledge. Justified belief, on the other hand, is by far the most common mode of our successful cognition, with enormous power of extending our cognitive grip beyond the little which, strictly speaking, can be known. Now, there is an obvious objection to this, and this is that the bar for knowledge is set too high. I have 3 replies to this objection, and I will go very briefly now to these replies. My first reply is ad hominem, as it were. Those who think that knowledge is a kind of belief are hardly in a position to complain that on this account, on my account, too much of our cognition counts as belief. I recognize all their distinction, Gettyized against not Gettyized cases, strongly justified belief against not justified belief, belief which tracks truth in a non-accidental way, and all that. But I argue for a mental state which is ontologically distinct from any sort of belief, whereas for them, all our cognition is at bottom some kind of belief. My second reply is that there is a social dimension to knowledge, and this social dimension allows us to count as known by the community rather than by each individual in the community those aspects of what is, with which some group and or individual in the community has or has had the kind of cognitive contact required for knowledge. seems to me that science is a prime example of this, and that there are things in science which the scientific community knows in the strong sense in which I am using knowing collectively, although they are not known distributively by each individual in that scientific community. And it seems to me that mutando mutandis, a similar story can be run also for our day-to-day cognition. Third, an important aim of my project is to stress the crucial contribution to our cognition of a cognitive mode irreducibly other than knowledge, namely belief. Belief, on my account, is not something substandard because belief has its own standards, namely justification, degrees of probability, level of support by reasons, and so on. It is a different, indispensable, and complementary way to engage cognitively with reality and or with the world. So in my view, to acknowledge that much of what we do in our successful cognition is justified by belief rather than strictly speaking knowledge, acknowledging this makes it even more important that belief meets certain criteria of justification, of probability, and so on. Conversely, it seems to me that an inflated use of the notion of knowledge often goes hand in hand with fundamentalism and dogmatism. So knowledge first, but give belief its due. I come now to the third part of my proposal, in which I apply this model to religious belief in particular. In my view, the conception of knowledge and belief as two irreducibly different cognitive modes is especially important in religious epistemology in safeguarding the distinctive epistemological status of religious belief. Thinking with Assent offers an account of religious belief alternative to that advanced by the influential movement known as Reformed epistemology. Its chief proponent, Alvin Plantinga, maintains that faith is knowledge. I quote from his very important 2000 book, and that warranted Christian belief in God, if true, counts as knowledge. Now, at the root of these claims lays an account of knowledge as a kind of belief which meets certain criteria. According to this very externalist version, truth and warrant. Enough warrant, Plantinga argues, turns Christian belief, if true, into knowledge. Now, once the project of turning belief into knowledge through the addition of necessary and sufficient conditions is abandoned, as I am arguing, the scene is set for a fundamentally different approach also to religious epistemology. This alternative approach, which is my approach, fully acknowledges the distinction between knowledge and belief. While my project shares Plantinga's aim of defending religious belief from the charge of irrationality, it regards the project of turning religious belief into knowledge as misguided. And why do I think so? Because it seems to me that if much of our successful cognition is justified through belief rather than strictly knowledge, it is hardly surprising that when the putative, when the object of that of our cognition is some putative supernatural entity, the correct, the appropriate mode of cognition is belief rather than knowledge. And it seems to me that ultimately, not recognizing the distinction of kind between knowledge and belief does not help the case of religious belief. On the contrary, it undermines the aspect of epistemic uncertainty and therefore the aspect of trust which is traditionally central, or at least a very important element in the very notion of faith. I come now to my last slide. I will say just a few words about the methodological approach of my project. As an historian of philosophy, I think that philosophy has a great deal to gain from a deep engagement with its history, and methodologically thinking with assent is an illustration of this view. A distinctive feature of this project is its ambition to contribute to contemporary debates by rediscovering and renewing some key historical insight. Thank you very much.